August 1944, Northern Italy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring stood over his maps with the confidence of a man who believed geography itself had become his ally. The Gothic line stretched across the narrowest point of the Italian peninsula, 300 miles of fortifications carved into mountains so steep that even the Romans had feared to cross them. 2,000 machine gun nests, 479 concrete bunkers, 30,000 meters of anti-tank ditches. Behind it all, peaks rising over 6,000 feet, with slopes that defied modern warfare. Kesselring told his staff he could hold this line with just 11 divisions. The terrain would do most of the work. What he didn't know, what his intelligence officers hadn't told him, what seemed impossible to German doctrine, was that the British had already solved the problem. Not with tanks, not with new technology, but with animals older than Rome itself, modified in ways no ancient army had ever imagined. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these untold stories from World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's return to the mountains of Italy, where thousands of silent mules were about to prove that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most revolutionary. Kesselring studied the terrain with the satisfaction of a chess master who knows his opponent has no good moves. The northern Apennines weren't just difficult, they were impossible for mechanized warfare. Modern armies needed roads, tanks required bridges, artillery demanded stable firing positions. The British Eighth Army, approaching from the south, had none of these advantages. Every valley was a kill zone. Every ridge commanded the approaches below. German observation posts on the peaks could direct fire onto any movement across miles of open ground. The mathematics favored the defense so heavily that Kesselring privately believed the Gothic line might hold until winter made operations impossible, buying Germany precious months, perhaps enough time to deploy new weapons, perhaps enough to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, anything to avoid total defeat. General Heinrich von Wettenhoff commanded the German forces in the central sector. He was an intellectual among Wehrmacht generals, a Rhodes Scholar who spoke fluent English and had studied at Oxford before the First World War. He understood British military thinking better than almost any other German commander, and when he looked at the terrain, he saw salvation. Monte Altuzzo rose 5,700 feet. Monte Monticelli reached 5,200. An endless succession of peaks, each commanding the valleys below, each turned into a strong point with interlocking fields of fire. The few roads were obvious death traps that could be demolished within hours. After that, any attacking force would have to move cross-country, climbing slopes that exhausted even fit young soldiers, while carrying ammunition and equipment on their backs. Von Wettenhoff told his staff that each German division could hold a frontage 3 times wider than doctrine normally allowed. 3 soldiers with a machine gun on a ridge could stop a company. A single well-placed mortar team could interdict an entire valley. The mountains multiplied defensive strength by factors that made conventional planning obsolete. What von Wettenhoff didn't factor into his calculations was that the British had been preparing for this battle since Monte Cassino fell in May. While German engineers built bunkers, British quartermasters were buying every mule they could find in southern Italy. While German intelligence tracked British vehicle movements, British muleteers were training animals and men for mountain warfare. And while German doctrine insisted modern armies needed roads, British planners were remembering lessons learned on the northwest frontier of India, where the Raj had fought mountain tribesmen for a century. The solution was ancient. Mules, not trucks, not jeeps. 4-legged pack animals that could climb 45-degree slopes, navigate narrow mountain trails in complete darkness, carry 200 pounds of supplies for hours without complaint, and most critically, when properly modified, move in near-perfect silence. By August 1944, British procurement officers had purchased approximately 15,000 mules from Italian farmers and breeders. Prices started at $80 per animal, but quickly rose to $250 as demand outstripped supply. Quality varied wildly. Some were young and strong, ideal for the mountains. Others were old, barely trained, purchased, knowing they might survive only a single trip to the front lines. The mathematics of mountain supply were brutal and unforgiving. A single British infantry regiment required 250 mules per day just to maintain operations. Each rifle company in mountain terrain needed approximately 40 mules. Battalion headquarters required several dozen more. Medical sections had dedicated animals for casualty evacuation. Multiply this across an entire division, and the numbers became staggering. The British Eighth Army needed thousands of mules working every single night to keep forward positions supplied with ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. But quantity alone wouldn't solve the problem. The mules had to move silently. German positions dominated every valley. Sound carried impossibly far in mountain air. A single bray could alert sentries a mile away, bringing artillery fire down on supply columns. British veterinary officers found their solution in an experimental procedure developed for Chindit operations in Burma. Dr. A.J. Moffat had perfected a 3-minute surgical technique to remove a mule's vocal cords. The operation used local anesthetic with the animal standing. Recovery took less than an hour. The mule could return to work the same day. The silence was absolute. A mule without vocal cords couldn't bray, couldn't whinny, couldn't make any sound louder than a quiet snuffle, even under extreme stress. German sentries might hear boots scuffing rock, might detect the occasional metallic clink of equipment, but they would never hear the distinctive bray that announced a mule train approaching. British muleteers took additional precautions. Metal carabiners were wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. Water containers were filled completely to prevent sloshing. Night movements followed strict silence protocols. Even the animals themselves were modified for operations. Light-colored mules attracted attention, so procurement officers sprayed them with potassium permanganate solution, creating a brownish tint that lasted up to 2 months. In the mountains, even the color of an animal could mean the difference between life and death. The men who led these silent mule trains came from across the Commonwealth. Cypriot muleteers formed entire companies, drawing on generations of experience with pack animals in the eastern Mediterranean. Indian Army units brought expertise honed on the northwest frontier, where mountains and mules were the only way to wage war against Pashtun tribesmen. British soldiers, many from agricultural backgrounds, learned the trade through intensive training courses that compressed months of experience into weeks of instruction. The training was demanding and specific. Mules had to be desensitized to gunfire and explosions. They learned to navigate rivers, bridges, rough terrain, while carrying heavy loads. About 1/3 of candidate animals were eliminated during testing for gun shyness or temperament problems. Female mules were strongly preferred. They had more stable temperaments under fire, were less aggressive toward each other in close quarters, and adapted better to the stress of constant shelling. The British selected Italian mules carefully. The animals averaged 14.2 hands for feet, 10 inches at the shoulder and weighed between 900 and 1,200 pounds. Standard payloads were 180 to 200 pounds for extended campaigns. Good mules could carry 250 to 300 pounds. The general rule was 1/3 of body weight, though experienced muleteers could sometimes push this limit with the right animal and proper load distribution. Each mule required 10 pounds of grain daily, plus grazing time of at least 2 hours. Water was critical, especially in summer heat. A working mule needed several gallons per day. British quartermasters had to factor animal logistics into every operational plan, but the payoff was transformational. A mule could go where no vehicle could follow. Steep mountain trails that exhausted soldiers became routine routes for trained animals. Narrow paths along cliff edges, boulder fields, river crossings at night terrain that stopped tanks and trucks was merely another day's work for a good mule and an experienced handler. The British Eighth Army could maintain forward positions that German planning had assumed were impossible to supply. Observation posts on peaks over 5,000 feet received regular deliveries. Rifle companies dug in on ridgelines, got ammunition resupply every night. Artillery batteries on mountainsides fired hundreds of shells, all carried up by mules. And unlike trucks, mules left almost no trace. A vehicle convoy raised dust visible for miles, created noise audible across valleys, was limited to established roads that German artillery had pre-registered. A mule train moving at night across mountain trails was nearly undetectable. British forces could reinforce positions, rotate tired units, position artillery in unexpected locations, without German intelligence detecting the movement. The Gothic Line offensive began on August 25, 1944. British Eighth Army attacked along the Adriatic coast in a carefully orchestrated deception. Montgomery had planned this before being recalled to command for Normandy. He wanted the Germans looking east, while the real blow fell in the mountains. For 10 days, the deception held. Kesselring moved reserves toward the coast, believing the main attack was developing there. Then, on September 10th, the British 13th Corps struck into the mountains. The British 78th Infantry Division, the Battle Axe Division, led the assault. They had earned Montgomery's personal praise as the best mountain warfare division in the British 8th Army. Their commander, Major General Charles Cately, understood that mountains favored the defense, but only if the attacker accepted conventional limitations. The 78th Division did not accept those limitations. Their battalions advanced with mule trains, following immediately behind the assault companies. As soon as a position was secured, muleteers brought up ammunition, supplies, medical equipment. Forward companies never ran short. When German counterattacks came, British riflemen had full ammunition pouches. But the real transformation came with British artillery. Standard 25-pounder guns weighed over 3,000 pounds far, too heavy for mule transport. But the British had also deployed 3.7-inch mountain howitzers, specifically designed for pack animal operations. These weapons could be completely dismantled into 6 loads, each weighing less than 250 pounds. 6 mules carried 1 complete howitzer, ammunition, and firing equipment. The tactical implications were revolutionary. British gunners positioned artillery on mountain ridges where German doctrine said artillery could not exist. Observation posts on peaks directed fire from batteries located on adjacent mountains. German troops moving through valleys suddenly found themselves under bombardment from positions they couldn't see, located on terrain they believed impossible for guns. The British 8th Indian Division joined the mountain assault in September. This formation brought expertise unmatched in mountain warfare. Indian Army units had fought on the northwest frontier for generations. Gurkha battalions from Nepal, Punjabi companies, Rajputana, Riflemen understood mountain fighting instinctively. They moved through terrain that exhausted European soldiers. They climbed at night without hesitation. At Monte Cassino, they had crossed the Gari River on May 11th in an assault that proved critical to finally breaking that terrible position. Now they brought that experience to the Gothic Line. Indian Army muleteers managed pack trains with casual efficiency that amazed British observers. A Punjabi havildar could load for mules in the time it took a British corporal to load 2. Gurkha riflemen thought nothing of climbing 5,000 feet, carrying full equipment, then fighting a battle at the summit, then climbing back down to resupply. And behind every advancing Indian battalion, mule trains delivered the supplies that made sustained operations possible. Where British units required careful planning and detailed orders to organize a mule lift, Indian Army companies simply did the work. Muleteers understood their animals, knew the routes, anticipated problems, and solved them without consulting officers. The German defenders fought with their customary skill and courage. Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers held many positions. Elite troops experienced from Crete and Russia, experts at defensive warfare. They had prepared positions for weeks. Every approach was registered for mortar fire. Machine guns had interlocking fields of fire. But German planning had not accounted for the British supply capability. When a British company assaulted a German position and was repulsed with heavy casualties, German doctrine expected the attack to fail. The attacking unit would be exhausted, low on ammunition, unable to renew the assault for hours or days. Instead, British units reorganized, received ammunition, resupply via mule train, brought up reinforcements, and attacked again within hours. Sometimes, before the Germans had finished evacuating their own wounded, the psychological effect on German defenders was significant. They inflicted casualties. They stopped attacks. Then British forces came again fully supplied, fully equipped, as if the previous assault had never happened. Fallschirmjäger veterans who had fought in Russia recognized this pattern. Soviet human wave attacks had the same relentless quality. But these weren't conscripts being driven forward. These were professional British and Commonwealth soldiers, tactically competent, well-led, adequately supplied even in impossible terrain. Monte Grande fell to the 78th Division in mid-September after days of intense fighting. The Battle Axe Division lost heavily, but they took the peak. German counterattacks were beaten back by British artillery positioned on adjacent ridges courtesy of mule transport. Within 24 hours of securing the position, British engineers had expanded mule trails sufficiently to bring up heavier equipment. The fighting became terrible arithmetic. German positions were strong but limited in depth. Once British forces broke through the initial fortifications, the defenders had few prepared fallback positions. The mountains that made the Gothic line so formidable as a barrier worked against tactical flexibility. Once that barrier was pierced, meanwhile, British mule trains continued operating every night. Muleteers learned the routes through repetition. Experienced handlers could navigate mountain trails in complete darkness, guiding their animals by touch and memory. The Germans tried to interdict these supply lines with artillery and mortars, but targets were fleeting and difficult to hit. A stationary truck convoy on a road was easy to destroy. A mule train moving across open mountain terrain at night, dispersed, silent, and mobile, presented no worthwhile target. British casualties were significant. Mountain warfare extracted a terrible price. The 78th Division alone suffered thousands of casualties, pushing through the Gothic line positions. The 8th Indian Division lost hundreds of men. Gurkha companies were reduced to half strength, then reinforced, then reduced again. Royal Artillery forward observers who directed fire from exposed positions died at appalling rates. Muleteers leading supply columns through contested terrain took casualties from artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. But the offensive continued. The British could replace losses. Mules kept forward units supplied. Artillery ammunition never ran short. Medical evacuation using mules as ambulances meant wounded men reached aid stations within hours, rather than being left on the battlefield. The system worked. It was unglamorous, physically demanding, dependent on animals and the men who handled them. But it worked where modern mechanized logistics failed. By late September, the Gothic line had been decisively breached in multiple sectors. German forces were falling back toward the Po Valley. Kesselring's 11 divisions were no longer enough. The terrain advantage had not compensated for British determination and logistical innovation. Von Weddinghoff, watching his carefully prepared positions abandoned one after another, recognized what had happened. The British had solved the mountain supply problem. They had sustained offensive operations where German planning assumed supply difficulties would halt any attack. In his post-war memoir, he wrote with grudging respect about Allied capabilities in Italy. But he did not specifically discuss mules as a tactical surprise. For German commanders, the shock was not the method, but the result. British forces had maintained operational tempo and terrain that should have stopped them. How they achieved this was less important than the fact that they had. The numbers tell the story more precisely than any testimony. British and Commonwealth forces procured 15,000 mules for the Italian campaign, with 11,000 actually issued to formations. Each infantry regiment required 250 mules daily. Multiply this across multiple divisions operating simultaneously and the scale becomes clear. Thousands of animals, tens of thousands of loads, millions of pounds of supplies all moved across mountains, where vehicles could not go. Captain Joachim Constantinou Scarper deserves particular mention. 25 years old, from Dora village in Cyprus. He led mule trains through Death Valley at Monte Cassino in February 1944. German artillery and machine guns had Death Valley registered perfectly. Crossing those 7 miles required moving at night, dispersed quickly. Scarper made the journey repeatedly. Some of his mules died, killed by shell fragments or machine gun fire. Men died too, but the supplies got through. Indian soldiers holding positions on the mountainside received ammunition, food, and water because Cypriot muleteers were willing to lead animals through German fire. The Gothic line had been broken by late October 1944, after 2 months of sustained fighting. British and Commonwealth forces had broken through positions German engineers believed could hold for 6 months or longer. The cost was heavy, over 14,000 casualties, but the line was broken. The road to the Po Valley lay open, and it was broken by mules. Silent, patient, hard-working animals that modern military doctrine had dismissed as obsolete. German planning relied on terrain to stop mechanized armies and choke Allied supply lines. But the British overturned every assumption by using methods as old as Rome: pack animals, mountain trails, and relentless nighttime logistics. The 8th Army broke the Gothic line with infantry courage, precise artillery, sharp tactics, and mules. Histories celebrate the first 3. The 4th made victory possible. Without those silent animals hauling supplies through darkness, the offensive would have stalled. Instead, a fortress meant to hold 6 months fell in 2. Technology helps, but fundamentals win wars. Geography ignores doctrine. Victory goes to those who solve the problem even with 4-legged patience.